Thanks, Elizabeth. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the Orbis Cascade Alliance Summer Meeting. My name is Josie Regolia, and I am from Pacific University, and I'm also the chair of the Summer Meeting Program Committee. So we have a really great lineup of content coming over the next 3 days, so we're really excited that you're here. But before we begin, we're just going to go over a couple of logistics and housekeeping items. So you'll notice that when you came in, you're muted, and we'll ask you to remain muted during the presentations. During the meeting, if you do become unmuted and you aren't speaking, our Alliance staff host, which is Elizabeth, will mute you. If you have any problems, you're welcome to send a private Zoom chat to Elizabeth directly. And if you do wish to speak, we will have a Q&A section at the end of most sessions. You can use the raise hand icon in Zoom, and we'll call on your questions in that order. So the raise hand icon is just in the menu at the bottom of your screen to the far right. You'll see a reactions button with a smiley face and a plus sign, and you'll also see a raise hand there. So also feel free to post questions or comments in the chat, and we'll get to those as well. We also will be posting recordings of today's sessions online, and you'll receive an email when those are available, so you'll be able to rewatch some of our sessions. So now I'd like to turn it over to Kim Armstrong and Isaac Gilman for a formal welcome to the meeting. Kim is the Executive Director of the Orbis Cascade Alliance, and Isaac is the Dean of Libraries at Pacific University and the outgoing Chair of the Alliance Board of Directors. After that, we'll be welcoming our very first speaker, Trevor Dawes. So go ahead, Kim.
Thank you, Josie. Can we have the next slide, please? So before anything else, we want to both acknowledge and celebrate the resilience that all of you, staff and faculty at member libraries, Alliance Central staff, council members have demonstrated over the last 18 months. At the risk of sounding a little bit like a middle school essay, this is a common definition of resilience: adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. Next slide, please. And that feels like a pretty good synonym for 2020 and a lot of 2021 so far. Next slide. So everywhere we looked around the Alliance over the past year and more, we found adaptation in the face of adversity. These chronologically progressive alerts from the Pacific website are emblematic of what I think we've all experienced: sudden library closures and moving to all online services, transitions to limited in-person services, and in many cases, eventual moves to welcoming our community back into our facilities, with our frontline staff bearing the burden of cleaning, enforcing masking, reading the latest CDC recommendations, quarantining materials. Next slide, please. And here in the Northwest, even working through smoke and fire. Next slide. So interestingly, one of the key strategies for building resilience is to reach out to others, to rely on relationships and community. And over this past year, we've seen this demonstrated through the Alliance and have been encouraged to see all of you connecting with one another as sources of support, information, commiseration, and community. Next slide, please. While we were responding to the COVID-19 pandemic as a community, we've also been called as a community to respond in new and more urgent ways to the realities and impacts of systemic racism and oppression within our country. Next slide, please. The murder of George Floyd by a police officer led to a new level of collective action across the country that had been building through the long line of publicized police murders of Black Americans over the past 5 years, including Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile, Botham Jean, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, among many others. Next slide, please. And that, combined with the ways in which the pandemic exposed anew, in undeniable ways, systemic inequities, discrimination, and oppression, for example, the disparate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color and history of medical violence against Black and Indigenous communities in the US, that's led our member libraries and the Alliance itself to more intentionally examine the role of academic libraries in our work in oppression and racism. There are many within the Alliance community who have been living with this and doing this work for years. I want to acknowledge that. But for many, the past year has also brought us more directly into conversations and work that we had previously had the privilege, and specifically the white privilege, to be unaware of or to look away from or minimize. So as we, both individually, institutionally, consortially, move forward and make good on the commitments that we've made in the past year, we have to make sure that our engagement in EDI work, in anti-racist work, and anti-oppression work is meaningful and sustained, and not simply temporary and performative. This really is the reason for the summer meeting. We've been working within our own libraries over the past year, and the Alliance's Equity Exploratory Committee has been working on what it looks like for a consortium community to engage in this work. But this is the first time that we've really come together as a whole Alliance community to learn and to collectively focus on actions we can take and should take to make our libraries more inclusive and to identify and work against racist assumptions and practices that are built into our library services. Next slide, please.
Just as the Alliance can contribute to the individual resilience of our community members, it's our hope and belief that we also can model and help contribute to equitable and inclusive practices for our member libraries. To that end, we are working to create a more inclusive Alliance through individual growth and development opportunities like this summer meeting. This wouldn't have been possible simply if we were having to come together face to face. So the virtual experience here is a richer experience. Later this month, anyone from a member library will be given the opportunity to designate a preferred name and pronouns to be used both in Alliance work environment and in Alliance documentation. Another step we'll be taking this year is to develop an Alliance code of conduct that will cover all aspects of our collaboration and shared work within the Alliance. We invite any of you to submit your own ideas that will encourage the broadest engagement across the membership in ways that advance our Alliance goals of a consortium where all are free from discrimination. Next slide, please. Earlier this year, the Alliance joined other consortia and libraries nationwide to replace the Library of Congress Illegal Alien Subject heading, an effort that has been stalled at LC since 2016. The Helmer Awards provide funding to promote collaboration and learning across the Alliance. This year, monies were awarded to projects that demonstrate collaboration and support anti-racist or otherwise promote diversity, equity, and inclusion within the Alliance community. The Equity Exploratory Committee completed its first year of work and is already bringing us together through work on shared terms, key concepts, and DEI metrics. And finally, our unique and local content community has been working collaboratively to acknowledge bias in problematic content and unique materials when collections are represented in Alma Primo. And if you want to know more about any of these, they're all sessions coming up over the next few days. Next slide, please. I had to put in a brag slide. I have to say the great work of our board, of our council, of our teams and groups, and of our Alliance staff cannot be overlooked during an extraordinary year. Thanks to the RSF community, we instituted summit renewals, and 60% of patron loans are being renewed. So that means that we're meeting a great demand for your users for this content. Thanks to the tech services, systems, and other teams, the Primo VE migration plan is underway. Thanks to Council for designating and acknowledging the need for the streaming media so necessary during the COVID instruction time. And we've had extraordinary response to our Avon streaming media package. The DUX team launched the long-awaited and much-needed DUX accessibility toolkit. Thank you to our shared content community for launching Consortia Manager fully. The ULC team completed a DPLA ingest of over 50,000 digital objects representing Alliance collections. And finally, a staggering 1,800 Zoom sessions with 14,000 participants. Next slide, please. Just as we all are thinking ahead to what the coming year holds personally and for our libraries and patrons, the Alliance has been making plans as well. Acting on our open statement that was released in June, our OER standing group will be focused on our Open Education Network membership and working with members to highlight benefits and opportunities from that membership. The e-content and ebook standing group will be looking for ways to support open content with our collective investments. And perhaps most importantly for our future, we will develop an evaluative framework to determine when open solutions are best suited to Alliance goals. Next month, our consultants will deliver a highly anticipated white paper on the future of resource sharing in the Alliance. While the Summit program will always be a fundamental value, prioritizing digital collections and access models for sharing will align with the ways that libraries are acquiring and delivering content. A group of archives and manuscripts folks will conduct a community-wide assessment to ensure that that program is aligned with member expectations and goals. And finally, 8 libraries have agreed to participate in a series of ALMA optimization workshops to address workflow enhancements and streamline operations. The results of the first round will be evaluated for effectiveness and broadening member participation. Next slide, please. We've made very intentional efforts over the last year to engage with you and to tell you more about the impact of our work together. We have an updated website. We've revised our newsletter format. You can subscribe to that anytime. We relaunched our Facebook and our Twitter accounts. Please follow us or give us your news so that we can amplify your own messages. And I do invite you to join us in our work. Share your knowledge, influence us, build a network of amazing colleagues, and gain professional knowledge. It's truly, truly a rewarding community. Next slide, please. On to the conference. The Program Planning Committee has put together what I like to call a national quality conference for a regional audience. Let me thank Josie Regolia, Chair, Margaret Alexander, Hannah Cremay, Shelley Carr, Robert Parrott, Mary Grinchy, and Elizabeth Duell for all their work as the Program Planning Committee. We have superb programs from our own Alliance experts, and we're also fortunate to have some of the most prominent individuals working in libraries here to share their thinking, but more importantly, to share their actions and ideas about moving DEI from words to work. I hope all of you have earmarked the next 3 days for our conference. We had unprecedented demand for slots to register. It's gratifying to me to see our group of 37 libraries and our consortium as a whole give this summer meeting to the critical work of DEI and anti-racism. Let's learn together, let's talk together, and let's leave inspired with the ways that each of us has a role in making real, systemic, and lasting change. Back to you, Isaac.
Thanks. So just in order to further build anticipation for our first speaker, I'm going to go through some housekeeping details again for those of you that have just joined us. So if you have just joined us, you'll notice that you came in muted, so please remain muted during the presentation. During the meeting, if you become unmuted and aren't speaking, Elizabeth will mute you. If you do have any problems, please send a private Zoom chat to Elizabeth Duell in the chat. At the end, when we go through the Q&A, if you'd like to speak, please use the raise hand icon in Zoom here, and we'll try and call on questions in that order. You're welcome to put them in chat as well if you'd like. If you need to know where the raise hand icon is, it's down in the bottom under the reactions tab with the smiley face and the plus sign. You'll find the raise hand there. So without, and I should note that this session is being recorded, and so we'll be posting recordings of the sessions online, and you'll get an email when they're available. So now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. I'm pleased to introduce Trevor A. Dawes as our opening speaker today. Trevor has worked in the academic library sector for over 20 years, developing and providing a range of service-enhancing training and professional development opportunities that positively impact library-wide projects and programs. Trevor also facilitates workshops on leadership development and diversity, improving the knowledge, skills, competencies, and abilities of librarians and library workers. A published author and presenter, Trevor has written or edited books, book chapters, and articles, and presented on a variety of topics at local, national, and international conferences. Trevor earned his Master of Library Science from Rutgers University and has 2 additional master's degrees in educational leadership and educational administration from Teachers College, Columbia University. Trevor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Isaac, and good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Can someone just give me a thumbs up or signal? Great, thank you. So thank you so much, Josie, and the planning team and the Alliance for inviting me to speak with you today about a topic that is not only important, thank you, Elizabeth, not only important to me, but clearly important to you and the entire library profession. We've seen an increased focus on EDI and social justice efforts, especially over the last year. Both Kim and Isaac made reference to this already. As you all know, we recently acknowledged the anniversary of George Floyd's murder, an event that really sparked a sea change in the way many of us approach the work that we've been doing in our libraries, in our institutions, and in our communities. And thank you, Isaac, for referencing some of the other Black and Brown people who have died at the hands of people who are to serve and protect. The conviction of the former police officer who killed Mr. Floyd offered some sense of closure, but we all know this is not the end of the racial injustices that we see in our society and how we need to address them. We often struggle with creating and fostering the environments in which we embrace diversity and where all the members of our community can not only survive, but really thrive. We also struggle with having difficult conversations about race, about diversity, equity, about social justice. Although these are fundamental in creating the environment where all of our voices all of our perspectives are welcomed, are respected, and indeed are valued. The American Council of Education notes that institutions that work to embrace diversity within their values and programs provide an enriched educational experience for their students, where personal growth is promoted and it produces graduates that are ready to lead in a complex, pluralistic society. Many of our campuses have turned to a chief diversity officer to provide leadership for initiatives that explore and enhance how a diverse and inclusive institution can contribute to their missions. And we've also seen what appears to be a growth in the number of senior library positions devoted to EDI and anti-racism recently. But this work is not the work of a single individual. It is the responsibility of all of us to build inclusive institutions. So in my talk today, I'll share the definition of equity, diversity, and inclusion that the ALA task force, of which I co-chaired, developed, and that we, the task force members, are hoping will gain some traction across the profession. I'll also share some demographic data about libraries, which may or may not be surprising. I suspect it won't be surprising. And then I'll speak about how some of our spaces are working to create the sort of inclusive environments that we talk about. I'll note at the outset that diversity and inclusion work requires, as the former president of Princeton University, Shirley Tillman, would say, eternal vigilance. I hope that by the end of this discussion, and I hope that we have time for discussion, actually I built in time for discussion, we'll all walk away with some additional tools for managing diversity and inclusion in our own workspaces. Next slide, please. Before beginning, I'll take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Delaware sits and occupies today as the traditional home of the Lenni Lenape and Nanticoke tribal nations, the Delaware nations, without whom we would not have access to this gathering. So I take this opportunity to thank and express gratitude to the original caretakers of this land. And I hope that you take the time to learn more about and acknowledge the ancestors and original caretakers of the land on which you sit. Thank you. Next slide, please. Before getting to some of the ways in which our organizations are working towards inclusive spaces, I think it's important to have some of this context of the profession and a little bit about me. Sorry, I'm at home, I live in a city, and I live near a hospital, so you may occasionally hear some sirens that I have sort of become accustomed to, pausing when they go by. So I've been doing research and work around diversity and inclusion since about 2005, so not really very long. And after working at predominantly white institutions where there's often been a need and and a desire to help make the campuses more welcoming and inclusive. I was often tapped to participate in a lot of these diversity initiatives because, I'm the expert. And so I took those opportunities to learn as I now advocate for everyone. As I also became more professionally active, I later chaired the American Library Association's Committee on Diversity. And in 2016, as I just said, co-chaired the ALA Task Force on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion with Martin Garner, who was then at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. I'm pleased to be here with you today, not as an expert on the topic, but as one who continues to learn about equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. And I hope that you will, in your own ways, continue to educate yourselves and your colleagues about these issues at your respective organizations, and indeed also within the broader information services community. After spending 2 years as co-chair of the ALA EDI task force, I'll share one of the first things that we did, and we thought it was important to define equity, diversity, and inclusion so that, at least within the association, we were all speaking the same language when we used those words. I'll share those definitions today, so when I use them, you know what I'm referring to by these terms. Next slide, please. In some spaces, we use the term equity and social justice interchangeably, and we'll use this word or phrase when we speak about addressing the underlying conditions or the systemic issues that continue to disadvantage certain groups or privilege certain groups over another. Equity assumes a process, a system, or a culture that is ultimately fair and in which all persons have equal access to opportunities. At my place of employment, we've been talking a lot about equity, especially over the last year and a half, when some systemic issues were brought to light in the wake of the pandemic and its impact on how we do our work. I encourage some conversations about this topic in the Q&A. If there's interest, I'd be happy to talk about what we've been doing. Next slide, please. Many of you have probably seen this or a version of this image, and we often speak about equality and confuse it with equity. But here in this image, what we see in the left photo is treating everyone the same, equality. But when everyone is treated equally, it still can advantage some people over others or disadvantage some, continue to disadvantage some over others, even giving more advantage to those who already are advantaged. In one definition of equity, we would provide different levels of support, in this case, the boxes, to help with access, but access still requires that support. In the third image, the one on the right, the focus is on the system. It was the wooden fence that prevented everyone from having access to the game in the same way. So by focusing on the fence, really by focusing on removing the barriers that advantage one group over another, everyone can have the same level of access to the game. Now, of course, we could still argue about why these three people are not in the ballpark to enjoy the game, but that's a different conversation. Next slide, please. Diversity not only encompasses our differences, but also our similarities. As a task force, we struggled with this definition as some members of the task force and of the broader community wanted to keep the definition focused on some of the visible diversity characteristics. While we understand the systemic oppression that members of some traditionally underrepresented groups have faced and continue to face, we wanted our definition of diversity to be more inclusive, and we therefore included those invisible characteristics such as different abilities, sexual orientation, religion, and others. But we intentionally chose not to list any of these so as to be inclusive. And this leads to the definition of inclusion. Next slide, please. We need our communities to move beyond the recognition or appreciation of our differences or of diversity. We must ensure that we listen to, respect, and value the unique qualities, skills, and experiences that each member of our community brings. We know, for example, that diversity of opinion leads to more successful teams. To be inclusive means that we respect and value each of these opinions. But before we talk about how we can incorporate these concepts in our libraries, let's look at some data. When we speak about diversity, we often go to those visible characteristics such as gender and race. And these are the data that are often collected and easily cited. The American Library Association conducted a major study in 2007, Diversity Counts, in which they began to systematically capture demographic data on their members. The data was updated, correlating it with the 2010 census data, and I suspect it'll be updated again after the release of the more detailed 2020 census data later this year. These are the data that we see about the general demographic makeup of the credentialed library population. Next slide, please. At the time of this ALA survey, again, this was in 2007, updated in 2010 and in 2012, the librarian population was 88% white and 83% female. Next slide, please. In a report published in August 2017 by Ithaca SNR, we see very little difference. And while there's a slight change in these numbers, it should be noted that the Ithaca survey was of academic libraries only, and primarily a subset of these, the Association of Research Libraries cohort. And here we see 61% female, and next slide, please, and 71% white. So not a significant difference in the demographics of this subset of libraries than there was in the broader ALA data set from almost 10 years earlier. Yet, and although there is some ability to refine the race and ethnicity data, it is likely that our HR systems, are not yet able, or were not in 2017, to record information about employees who identify as non-binary, for example. So we can identify employees who are of more than one race, but not those who identify in non-binary gender-specific ways. Next slide, please. Library directors from responding ARL libraries, although this was true for all respondents as well, were more likely to consider their own library as equitable versus the library community with respect to every measure. This was particularly true in the case of race and ethnicity, where library directors were 30 percentage points more likely to consider their library more equitable than the library community as a whole. Next slide. These library directors are also less likely to consider their library or the library community racially diverse as compared to equitable. In other words, while they believe there's equity in their library, they also recognize that there needs to be more representational diversity in their libraries as well. Next slide, please. As this chart shows a similar pattern between perceptions of equity and inclusion with one outlier. Library directors are slightly less likely to consider their own library to be as inclusive as the library community with respect to gender. The ALA and Ithaca reports looked at representational diversity, looking at the population at large and the population of librarians. It also looked only at race and ethnicity, gender and age, those visible or easily collected characteristics. These reports suggest that ALA and other library organizations have a lot more to do to recruit and to retain a more diverse workforce. In doing so, however, we must look at the different needs of the population served by various libraries, perhaps by region or by state or locality, to see if such representational diversity makes sense. It is important for all of us to understand that diversity does not equal quota. I'm merely suggesting that we understand that as the demographics of the United States continues to change, cultural heritage organizations will also have to change the ways in which we provide services to meet the needs of this changing population. And we need to learn and understand and appreciate the differences that our community members bring. One of the ways we can do so is by changing the face of our libraries to be more representative of the communities we serve and to value the principles of equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice in our spaces. Despite a myriad number of initiatives to recruit a diverse workforce, we continue to ask ourselves the same question about what progress we've made in terms of representational diversity, and also about the retention of BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color, librarians in our spaces. Next slide, please. To get a sense of this, especially after the murder of George Floyd and the resulting focus on social justice and anti-racism in many of our institutions, Ithaca SNR fielded another off-cycle survey in 2020 to help better understand the impact of these national social justice movements on academic libraries. The survey was sent in the fall of 2020 to 1,473 library directors, of which 638 returned completed questionnaires. The full report, National Movements for Racial Justice in Academic Library Leadership, is available on the Ithaca website, and I've put the link to that in the chat. The findings from the 2020 survey were not that significantly different from the survey done just a year previous as part of Ithaca's regular survey of library directors. However, the findings were included, next slide please, that library directors were more highly valued leadership capacities to foster equity, diversity, and inclusion than they did previously. So in 2020, where the arrow is pointing, we see that library directors value the ability to foster EDIA more than they did in 2019. However, relative to other competencies, it is still not very highly valued compared to the 5 skills, knowledge, abilities that are listed above it. So we're seeing, as I referenced earlier, a move to hire more senior positions with responsibility for EDIA goals. And so we'll be paying, certainly Ithaca will be paying a lot more attention to the success of these positions, and we'll continue to see whether these characteristics or skills are more valued by library directors in the future. Next slide, please. Library directors are also less confident in their personnel strategies related to equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. It's quite possible that directors equated this question with affirmative action and equal opportunity measures. And although in the 2020 survey, when the phrase anti-racist was used specifically, there was a slight drop in the number of directors who believe they have the right strategies, the right anti-racist strategies in place. Next slide, please. Most library directors did not expect that employees of color would be disproportionately affected by cuts due to COVID-19. Only 16% were concerned that BIPOC employees would be more adversely impacted by the pandemic. However, job types with relatively greater percentages of employees of color were more impacted by furloughs or role eliminations. Next slide, please. In correlating job categories and race and ethnic background from the earlier Ithaca survey, we know the job categories that are held predominantly by BIPOC employees. So those job categories are represented on this chart with the asterisk. So access services, technical services, finance and business operations, et cetera. I hope you can all see that clearly. And as you can see, those are the position categories that were most likely to be negatively impacted by the effects of the pandemic. Next slide, please. When it comes to collections, just over 30% of directors believe they have a strategy to build diverse collections. In this 2020 survey, when a new question about decentering white authors was asked, just less than 20% of the directors believe they have such a collection strategy. Some libraries will have a collection development diversity statement, and we've certainly seen movements across the country to address racist and colonialist language and subject headings, as was mentioned earlier, and other descriptors of works, not only in libraries, but also in archives and museums. And this work is ongoing and yet still developing in many ways. But beyond the collection development statements and work on descriptions, there are other strategies that libraries have employed to try to build more inclusive spaces. Next slide, please. This work includes creating research guides, hosting events and programs of various types, developing exhibitions, being a hub for open educational resources, which helps to offset the cost of education for students from low-income families, collaborating with others on our campuses and in our communities, supporting affinity groups, conducting climate assessments, developing buddy systems, implementing photo staff directories to help staff at least recognize, if not know each other better, putting diversity requirements in position announcements and more. I've already referenced the increase in senior level positions that are dedicated to EDI, anti-racism, and social justice. We've engaged in these activities for decades, and oftentimes they do seem performative, or they simply do not lead to real or sustained change in our organizational climates or cultures. Had these changes been sustained, I argue we would see more BIPOC librarians staying in the profession and also in more titled leadership roles. For those and libraries that haven't done extensive work in the area of EDI, these examples can serve as models and will help these cultural heritage institutions find a program, event, or initiative that will work for their setting. But these ideas are fairly easy and basic, yet still not universal. Incorporating diverse collections in classrooms or exhibitions is just a start. Most discussions about diversity, and indeed the focus of the ALA Diversity Counts or the Ithaca Report, is about the numbers, looking at the census data and making the case that the demographics of the profession as a whole should be reflective of the demographics of the larger society. However, diversity in its many forms can bring different and new ideas to the fore. It can redress past wrongs. It can help to establish a national society where we can learn to overcome, or at least acknowledge, our biases, and it can bring people together. It's easy to get and present data on race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status, gender, and age, some of which I've done, but less easy to get information on the other dimensions of diversity, such as religion, sexual orientation, and to some extent, disability status. But this is by no means an indication that we should ignore these invisible dimensions of diversity. In fact, it has become rather difficult, particularly in today's political and social climate, to ignore any dimension of diversity and how libraries are responding and should respond to concerns from staff and community members, however we define our communities, for the calls for inclusiveness. Next slide, please. There are many programs that are designed to increase representation of BIPOC librarians in the profession. Some of these programs are listed here. The ARL SAA collaboration is no longer funded, but this was a novel idea to bring librarians and archivists together. The ACRL Diversity Alliance brings together cohorts of diversity residents from across multiple institutions to provide leadership development and networking opportunities. And these are common across all the programs. But where are these librarians who participated in these programs? Why have the demographics of the profession not changed in the last 30 years, changed significantly in the last 30 years? I don't have a definitive answer to that question, but I suspect one area of concern is the talent management process. And so to dig deeper into this process, next slide, please. The libraries of SUNY Binghamton and the University of Delaware are conducting an audit that will examine efforts and outcomes related to anti-racism with a strong focus on the issues affecting Black people, given the disproportionate impact of systemic racism and the resulting inequities on this particular population. To begin this work, we'll focus on the talent management life cycle, although we're interested in collections, services, communications, and other elements of the library's work as accompanying and future elements of this audit. There may be opportunities in the talent management audit for us to begin to delve into some of these additional areas as well. In our experience, an audit style exercise can be effectively embedded in organizational efforts at driving improvements. And for this reason, we propose considering not only an audit of our current practices and outcomes, but also an examination of potential improvements. Next slide, please. So the overall project contains these elements. We examine employment, promotion, retention, and other talent patterns as they may differ on a racial basis to provide some baseline outcome metrics that identify inequities experienced by Black employees, by Black candidates, et cetera. We'll identify the relevant systems, structures, policies, and practices that may contribute to racism in some way within our organizations. And we'll recommend strategies for improvement and mechanisms for holding leadership accountable for change. The audit is intended to cover many facets of the talent life cycle, from existing organizational structures to hiring processes to separation processes. And this process can be completed in a single academic, we're working on a single academic, or in our case, a single calendar year, and hope all of these steps, or plan to have all of these steps undertaken again in 12 to 24 months to assess the change relative to the baseline metrics that we've gathered. So our process, we determine the current employee and candidate demographics, including current employees, staff versus faculty, or librarians versus staff. We are not faculty status at the University of Delaware, they are at Binghamton. We look at recent hires and promotions, recent candidate pools, hiring managers, search committee members, demographics, compare that with the campus demographics, et cetera. We've just completed the climate survey portion of the assessment and are revisiting current practices. Ithaca is analyzing the data as we speak. Later in the fall, or in the summer to the fall, we'll then examine our strategic plans to look at the language and the actions that are identified in our strategic plans to ensure that they are correlated with the goals that we will have set for at least the talent management portion of this audit. And we'll do the same once we have done the work with the other areas that I've mentioned. This project, as I mentioned, is taking place over the entire calendar year of 2021, and we hope to wrap this up, this first phase, by December of this year. Next slide, please. So the who, what, why, when, where, and how, I've talked a little bit about that. We've completed all the data gathering. Ithaca has that information. They've completed the climate survey. They will be conducting interviews with existing staff at both institutions. They will also be conducting interviews with candidates who were not recipients of positions at our institutions who are willing to participate in this information gathering phase to find out if they perceive any bias or specifically racial bias in the process of hiring as they were going through the process at our institutions. Next slide, please. And so what's next? With this audit, as with other activities at the University of Delaware, we're trying to lead from a social justice, or you can call it an equity perspective. We're being intentional about language, policies, procedures, and interactions that help to understand our systems of oppression and to break down the barriers to full participation of all of our community members. Is this easy? Absolutely not. Is everyone on board? Probably not. They say they are. And I say that not to doubt my colleagues, but this is difficult work. But we have diversity and inclusion goals for every staff member at our organization, and we speak openly about the political climate, especially over the last 5+ years, at least the 5 years that I've been at the University of Delaware. We host different forum about relevant topics, and we encourage and expect candor in all of our conversations. And these are some fairly simple ways to begin the conversations with those who may not have had it before, or for those who may be uncomfortable having the conversation. But the conversation is only the beginning. This work, the audit, all the work we're doing, it's important work and it's exhausting work. But to that, I remind you of Shirley Tillman's quote that I referenced at the beginning of my talk: we must be eternally vigilant. And so now I'd like to hear from you, your thoughts, your questions, your comments about what's happening in your spaces, or your questions about that which I've shared. And I welcome those now, and thank you. So next slide, please.
Thank you, Trevor. And just a reminder again, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please use the raise hand option. You can also put it in chat, but I know sometimes chat questions get lost in a room this size. So if you raise your hand, we'll be sure to see you.
And if it'll help, perhaps we could remove the slide because it's just my thank you slide. So yes, that may make it easier to see raised hands.
Thank you.
I should also say it's great to see so many familiar faces in this space. So Claire in the chat noted that was an amazing step. And I think you typed that when I mentioned that Ithaca will be interviewing candidates who did not get the positions at our institutions. And yes, we thought that was an important step we believe that's an important step in the process, because if we are to look at our talent management process to eliminate any semblance of anti-racism, then we need to know that the people who we interviewed, that they did not either believe or perceive any sense of anti-racism during that process. And we hope that they will be candid with an objective interviewer that we have through Ithaca, who will be reporting, obviously, the information back to us in confidence, actually in anonymous form, although we give them the names, but we don't know who they got in touch with or who's. So we're looking forward to that information, as we are with all the other information from the audit.
Oh, looks like there's a question in the chat from Madeline.
So you mentioned that personnel all have, they do all have DEI related goals. What are the goals? So, right, the goals could be, they range from something as simple as, participating in some sort of DEI related activity, professional development activity. The campus will offer them, or we make available, especially this last year, there were so many opportunities online to participate, not only in DEI related, but there are so many opportunities to participate in virtual events. And so we made access to a lot of those resources available. So that could be one. It could be writing about, presenting about, demonstrating, learning more about. So it was really up to the individual and their supervisor to determine what those DEI goals are, but everyone has to, it is a requirement to have a DEI goal in your annual performance appraisal. We started this 2 years. This is the second year that we have the DEI goal as a requirement in the appraisal process.
There's another question from Zan. Hi, Trevor. Thanks for the great talk. Is there a homepage for the talent management audit so I can follow along?
I should know the answer to that question. So Ithaca has a website, yes, and I'll get the link. Sorry, Lucy, but you asked if I had links. I should have had the link to this one as well. But I think it's easy to find. Ithaca talent management are the words that would get to that link quite easily. They do have a website. Because there's not much information to report at this point, it's really, the information there is just about the process. Once we have information to report, Curtis Kendrick, who is the director at Binghamton, and I will continue to do talks like this, sharing the results, and obviously Ithaca will be, sharing the results on the website as well.
Another question from Greg. What was the process that led you to select Ithaca as the consultant for the audit?
Yeah, so last summer, Curtis Kendrick and I, and Curtis is a friend and mentor of mine, and reached out to me, and we were talking obviously about the George Floyd killing and all the social unrest around anti-racism, around racism, and the desire for many of our libraries to do more work in anti-racist space. And he thought, so we were talking about doing some sort of an audit, but we wanted to have an objective third party to work with to ensure, or to try to ensure, some objectivity in the process. We landed on Ithaca for several reasons. One, they had done the 2020 survey. Ithaca is already working in this space in libraries. They've been paying attention to equity, diversity, and inclusion in libraries and museum spaces. They've been doing some work in this area. Curtis happens to be on the board of Ithaca, yes, no conflict of interest. And I was an advisor to the Ithaca in the 2020 survey. So there were lots of connections with Ithaca, and they were doing this work. They are a trusted source in our community, the library in our community, and so it was relatively. And when we approached them, they were very excited about working with us on the project.
There's a question from Sarah. Is the talent management audit being conducted alongside any other DEI audits or metrics in either institution?
So we're focusing on the talent management audit at the moment, although obviously there's some bleed into some of the other areas, right? Like communications or collections. So the focus right now is on the talent management audit, but there is some overlap in some of the other areas that we're addressing simultaneously, or we will be addressing simultaneously.
Question from Shelley. Have you faced any resistance to the required DEI goals from longtime library staff who haven't ever had to think about this, in quotes?
We did not. And as I mentioned, we've been having lots of conversations about equity, diversity, inclusion since I arrived at UD in 2016. Maybe fortunate to have arrived just at the time of the 2016 election. And so it was an opportune moment to have lots of conversations around social justice more broadly, but also about race in particular. And so those conversations that I started, then our diversity committee within the library sort of began this regular series of conversations, monthly series of conversations on a topic, on a DEI related topic. When we, in 2017, completed our strategic plan, our revised strategic plan, there was a foundational goal, a foundational premise of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So everyone also understood that this was important for the library, museums, and press. And so when we phased in, we also conducted in 2017 the climate qual assessment that then led to some significant changes in organizational structure and pay grades and a lot of work around social justice within the library and museums. And so that we did this later, was not a surprise to anyone. And they all had time to sort of think about diversity, equity, and inclusion for a few years before, and talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion for a few years before having to think about what their goals might be. And as I said, the goals could be very simple, but, and some of them are really just, take a professional development, participate in a PD opportunity, but some are more complex.
There's a question from Gary. He says, I'm curious to know if any of the upcoming audit items includes interviewing members of search committees who saw prejudices unfold but did not report them at the time, or reported them with apparently nothing changing as a result.
So the interview, staff will be interviewed. So they won't necessarily be interviewed as members of the search committee, but there will be members of search committees who will be interviewed because we're interviewing, Ithaca will be interviewing a large sample of the staff. And I hope that, I know that bias has creeped into the search process. I meet with every search committee as they are, while they're deliberating. After all the interviews are completed and they're deliberating, the search committees, as I let them know, they make a recommendation to the vice provost. And so it's easy for me to understand how they come to their recommendation if I hear the deliberations. And so there are times when I have called out, that's probably an overstatement. There were 2 instances where I've had to call out what I perceived as bias in the conversations. And so I hope that others would feel the same in calling those out as well during the interview process. I'm going to read and respond to a question. I think it was intended to be sent to the chat to everyone, but it was sent as a direct message. So does ALA or some other library organization offer some sort of a kit or brochures to have on hand for potential library students, particularly about potential scholarships? Like many libraries, we depend heavily on student workers. Making LIS work more obvious as a career path could be good. I'm not sure if there's a brochure per se, but there is information on the ALA website about their Spectrum scholarships and the programs that I referenced, like the Knowledge River at the University of Arizona, the ARL's Kaleidoscope program now. So there's information out there about programs that are designed to get more people, and particularly people of color, into the library profession. So yes, those do exist.
There's another question from Talia in the chat. Curious, in your audit, are you also looking at accessibility issues or concerns related to disability?
Yes, absolutely. And so one of the reasons I wanted to start the talk with the definitions that we created in ALA, which are the definitions that we're using at UD, include both the visible and invisible characteristics, but some disabilities fall into either category, both visible and invisible disabilities. So we are concerned about those as well. And thank you, Jen, for the Knowledge River link in the chat. Thank you, Claire. So we'll be, as I mentioned, we will be sharing much more information about the audit as we have more information to share. The process so far has been really great, working with our colleagues at Ithaca and at Binghamton University. There's a project team that at each of our institutions, they meet regularly every other week with the staff at Ithaca, and then Curtis and I will join them on a monthly basis, well, more like every 6 weeks, just for status update on what's going on. But the work is progressing as we hoped it would. As I mentioned, the next phase they're about to enter is the interview phase. So both the interviews of the staff as well as the interviews of the former candidates for positions. So, hopefully by early next year, we should have what may be a close to final report on the talent management piece as we begin to move into the other pieces of the audit as well.
Well, thank you. I don't see any more questions coming in, so if everyone would please join me in thanking Trevor for kicking off the summer meeting so well. However you virtually want to do that, through emoji or silent claps, loud claps. I'll also just note that Elizabeth has put a link to the session evaluation form in the chat, so if you take some time to fill that out. And again, there will be a recording of the session posted on the web later if you want to go back and revisit any of this information that Trevor shared. You'll get an email when that's available. So thank you all again for attending, and have a great summer meeting.
Thank you so much.